Hello and welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week, the focus is on a very interesting subject, which is the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. It was celebrated with aplomb on July the 1st, Thursday this week, and it marks 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party, which was born or formed on July 1st, 1921. President Xi Jinping had made this a very big calendar event for China and for himself personally. And you could see the way in which the event was conducted and the manner in which President Xi Jinping had, in a way, I would say, framed the narrative both about the party, its accomplishments, and what it means for China. And in the course of his speech, he also issued a very, very unambiguous warning to certain interlocutors. And the turn of phrase was, if I could put it mildly, harsh. To understand the implications of the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party, as also the linkage with the PLA, that is the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, because there is a symbiotic linkage between the party and the military going back to the early decades. And it has evolved, I would say, in three large phases. From 1921 to 51, the first phase of consolidation. From 51 to 81, the turbulent Mao Zedong years. And post 81, post Mao, the consolidation, till you come roughly, I would say, to President Hu Jintao. And now the last decade with President Xi Jinping. This is a very interesting, I would say, dynamic, the correlation between the party and the military. And of course, we are also in a post-Galwan phase. So what does all of this mean for India? To discuss this, I have great pleasure in welcoming and introducing Ambassador Shyam Saran. Now, I've said this many times, he does not need an introduction in India. और यदि हम श्याम सरन साहब के बारे में उनका जो प्रोफाइल है उसका वर्णन करें तो जहां तक कूटनीति का जो क्षेत्र है उसमें बिल्कुल दिग्गज माने जाते हैं। वो भारत के विदेश सचिव रहे हैं और उसके बाद प्रधानमंत्री मनमोहन सिंह साहब के साथ वो स्पेशल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव रहे हैं और अंतर्राष्ट्रीय जो क्लाइमेट चेंज वगैरह कई सारे नाजुक जो अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मुद्दे हैं वो भारत का एक प्रकार से शर्पा भी बने थे। Shyam sir, very glad to have you with us. Your experience in dealing with China at different levels is something that the Foreign Office often speaks about. So today when we have this particular discussion and we have enough time, you are our standalone guest. I thought I would request you first to talk about the event itself. July 1st, 2021. What did you make of the event and President Xi's speech? Shyam sir?
Thank you very much, Uday, and thank you both for your very kind words, but also for inviting me to engage in what I hope will be a productive conversation about some very important landmarks in both Chinese history and I would say even contemporary international history. So as you said, the 100th anniversary of the party has been celebrated with a lot of pomp and grandeur. There has been a speech by President Xi Jinping from the ramparts of the Tiananmen Square, in a sense, evoking some of the old images of Mao himself, making very landmark sort of speeches from that same spot, whether it was in 1949 when China was liberated and the People's Republic of China was established. Also during the Cultural Revolution, when you had very large masses of young people who had gathered together to answer his call for the Cultural Revolution. So I think one of the images that Xi Jinping wanted to project to both the people in China as well as to people outside China was that he is a leader in the same mold as those great revolutionary leaders of the past, including Chairman Mao. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is that this is a celebration of a triumph. And I think no matter how many sort of criticisms we levy on to the Chinese Communist Party and the manner in which China has developed and evolved over the last several decades, there is no doubt, I think we should accept that the recent history of China and the recent achievements of China, certainly in terms of its economic achievements, no doubt that this has been something quite spectacular. So while we may have a number of reservations, but I think we have to acknowledge that this is a celebration of, in fact, a great achievement. Not only in terms of the endurance of this Communist Party, but the fact that over the last 4 decades or so, it has certainly lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese from absolute poverty to many of them to almost middle class status, and appears to be on the road to even greater economic achievements. So the sense of triumphalism in one way can be perhaps understood as natural in the kind of circumstances that China finds itself. But having said that, I would like to make 2 points. One is you referred to the very starkly, I would say, arrogant and even threatening language that he used when he said that, if there is any attempt on the part of people outside China to try and bully China again or to harm China, they will face a steel wall. But not only a steel wall, but also there would be bloodied heads and broken bones if that were attempted. Now, this is wolf warrior language. So I think, in a sense, you can see where the wolf warrior diplomacy comes from, because it is, in a sense, reflective of what the number one man himself, is saying.
I mean, the
The
chief wolf
second,
in many ways. I'm saying he's
quite
the
right.
chief wolf.
Quite right. And the interesting thing is that the English language translation has left out this part. Although it has talked about steel wall, but it has left out this part about bloodied heads and broken bones, which figures in the Chinese language version. So obviously, as far as the domestic audience was concerned, this was something which was being presented as, a tough China standing up to any bullies from outside. But what struck me was that in the portion relating to the party structure, it is one thing to say that party is, the soul of the country, that the party has been responsible for all the great achievements that have been made by China, to talk about democratic centralism, to talk about the importance of party leadership. All that is fine. But for the man himself to say that you must observe the leadership core, which he is, because he has been described as the, the core of the leadership, and that you must obey the party code as represented by the general secretary of the party. So he's making no presenting no ambiguity, that he's basically telling people that I'm the undisputed leader of this country. Now, in one way, you can say it is arrogant. In another way, you can say it perhaps reflects some deep sense of insecurity as well, that you have acquired this much of authority and power, and yet you need to still tell people from from the rostrum of the Tiananmen that, look, I am your leader. I am the core, and don't forget that. So that struck me as perhaps a demonstration of a deeper insecurity about whether or not this can be sustained. The centrality of the party's leadership, as reflected in him as the core, can be. So these are two things which are important. Yes, the triumphalism is perhaps well founded to some extent, but secondly, it is also giving a sanction to the wolf warrior kind of diplomacy, very aggressive, even crude kind of language that has been used over the last few years. It appears to sanction that. And secondly, the very the kind of verbalization at his own level. It is one thing for party minions to say he's the core, but for him to say himself that I'm the core and don't forget it, that was something new for me.
I think, sir, there are two or three very important kind of strands that I'm going to pick up. Number one, I think you're right that he was trying to project the image of continuing in the mold of Chairman Mao. So if you look even at the choice of clothes, it's very similar to the Mao suit of that period. And that apart, I think the fact that there was a certain variance between what was reported to the domestic audience in China in the Chinese language and what was conveyed to the rest of the world in English, the fact that certain phrases were left out. I think this is a point that for us in India, China watchers, those who want to understand China, repeatedly need to be reminded that even something like the Global Times, which is often quoted, if you look at the English version of the Global Times, and I'm saying this more for the benefit of our viewers, especially our younger audience who is watching this program, that the Global Times in Chinese, very often in the editorials, in the reportage, you can see a certain variance. And I think this is the kind of signaling that China is, in a way, I would say now, practicing its skills, particularly as one of the elements of warfare. It is the third strand that they talk about, the narrative, the propaganda, and how you put out a certain issue. But there are two aspects that you have said, which I would request you to perhaps share your thoughts. That from Mao downwards, I think there is this correlation between the party and the military, and the dictum that power flows from the gun, from the barrel of the gun. At the same time, there is an element of insecurity, and this I'm paraphrasing from the commentary that some China watchers have shared. One is the whole political dynamic, which is the Bo Xilai experience. I mean, it's only in President Xi Jinping's tenure we remember what happened to his chief rival, which was Bo Xilai at that time. But also within the PLA, in the first few years, I mean, there was the equivalent of a purge, ostensibly to ensure that he had people who were absolutely loyal to him. Can you just share your thoughts about when we talk of the evolution of the party, how has Xi Jinping, as the president, general secretary, CMC, he's all in one, handled or managed this particular aspect, that is the linkage between the party and the top leadership of the PLA?
Yeah. So the first point to remember is that the PLA and the party have grown from the same root. And if you look at the first generation of leaders like Mao, or for example, people like Peng Dehuai, who was the marshal, Ye Chening, another marshal, if you take Deng Xiaoping himself, these were people who were both party leaders, but at the same time were also military leaders, active military leaders. I'm not just talking about having some kind of a lapel, but they were people who actually commanded armies, who fought with these armies. So there was virtually no kind of distinction between the PLA and the party, because the leadership of the PLA and the party were sometimes, the same people. Now, obviously, for functional reasons, when the People's Republic of China was established, for functional reasons, of course, there was a division which came about between the party and the state bureaucracy, for example. You had a division between the PLA and the party. Again, you had a organizationally different kind of structure adopted, but very importantly, the links between the party and the state, the party and the army, these links remained very strong, and sometimes even in the person of the say the party political commissar or the active military leader. So I think that history is very important to remember, that the kind of divisions which we may have had in other countries between the party and the military, that in China was a much more fungible kind of a relationship. So you could move, from example, from the army into the party, back into the party, and the party ensured right from the beginning that the office of the political commissar was always a very, very important relationship for exercising party's control and leadership over the armed forces. So that is one aspect to remember. And even today, you will find that the military is represented, for example, in the Central Committee of the party. It is represented at the moment, perhaps we do not have that, but the PLA was often represented in the Politburo, even in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Liu Huacheng, for example, was part of the Politburo. So if you take this relationship, as I said, the best way to understand it is it's a very fungible relationship. What is the difference, though? The difference is that the first generation and even second generation of leaders, because of their origins as both people who had seen active duty, military duty, and also a party leaders, commanded a certain respect and authority over the armed forces, just as they did over the party. So Deng Xiaoping is an excellent example of that. He was able to, for example, get the PLA to give up its commercial activities, which had started in the first years of reform. You know, the PLA was running various companies, hotels, and factories. So it was only Deng's authority made it possible for this very strong kind of a economic interest that the PLA had to actually dispense with that. The difference today is that the third generation, the fourth generation, fifth generation of leaders do not have that background. That means they have not served both as military leaders as well as party leaders, and hence the importance of maintaining influence or establishing influence within the armed forces. So the Posi Lai incident that you mentioned, you will remember that one of the great strengths of Posi Lai was that because his father was, again, one of the earlier generation leaders, he had actually tried to build upon those kind of networks that the older generation has to build influence within the PLA. And this was considered to be a great threat to somebody like Xi Jinping. So right from the beginning, Xi Jinping went about trying to establish control over the PLA, partly through purges, but also you saw the very dramatic restructuring that took place of the PLA, something that even Deng Xiaoping may not have been able to achieve. But, I think we must give credit to Xi Jinping that he was able to do that. And not only as party secretary, but also chairman of the Central Military Commission, but as president, the commander-in-chief of the army. So there is a combination. What he has tried to do is to recreate what was a natural kind of a authority which people like Deng Xiaoping enjoyed in the past. He has tried to compensate for not having that background by, in fact, bringing the topmost party position as chairman of the Central Military Commission and the presidency, which also then is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the principle is the same, that the armed forces are, in fact, a arm of the party.
Correct.
They are not a national army only. They are the party's army.
Correct, correct.
That is a very important distinction. That the first order of business of the armed forces is to safeguard the party.
Correct.
The safeguarding the nation comes next.
Next.
This is something which is very important. And I would like to, if you have a comment, please make the comment, because I want to go to another very important aspect, explaining the role of the army in the perspective of somebody like Xi Jinping.
I just want to add one comment here, sir, if I may, which is that while it is widely acknowledged that China has had this dramatic economic growth, and as you have said, it is no mean feat that such a vast number has been lifted out of poverty, and I think China must be given due credit for this particular achievement over the last 2 or 3 decades. But I think concurrently, we also have to acknowledge that the Chinese leadership from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping has also, in a way, nurtured the growth of the Chinese military. Particularly, I would say the emphasis on their trans-border military capability. Now, as a student of this, I would say that perhaps the 1991 war for Kuwait had a very significant impact on Chinese thinking.
Yes.
And in the last 3 decades, from 1991 to 2021, you can see the way in which the PLA has acquired tangible capability in the trans-border domain.
Yeah.
And the best example is the Navy. I mean, I would be forgiven if I say this as a sailor, but today China is building 20 to 25 warships of different size, including submarines, every year.
And aircraft carriers.
And carriers. And we are lucky, I'm giving this as an example about India, that we are lucky if we manage one in 4 to 5 years. So that is a sign of capability. But this is just a broad observation.
Yeah.
I'll come back to India later, but will you develop your point?
Yeah. So this, the modernization of the military, don't forget that in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping, in a sense, inaugurated the market reforms, he talked about the 4 modernizations. And the 4 modernizations were agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military. So modernization of military was an integral part of the blueprint which was put forward in 1978, which then was, in a sense, built up on over the succeeding years. So the military was very much part and parcel of this whole exercise of what Chinese later came to call comprehensive national power. So comprehensive national power has to be multidimensional. But it was also recognized that the base for military modernization, first and foremost, has to be economic modernization. If you do not have the economic resources, you cannot have military modernization. And I think that is a message that we need to also absorb, that the first order of business is to get your economic story right. Only then will other things follow. So that is one point. But with regard to, the status of the armed forces, there are 3, remarks made by Xi Jinping in internal party conferences or meetings, which are very worthwhile, noting. First of all, he said, and this was quite early during his period as a leader, that it must have been about 2014 or maybe even earlier, where he said that the greatest danger for China is that another Gorbachev may, be born in China and come to leadership in China. So this is and he apparently mentioned this to, I think, even a foreign leader who asked him, what keeps you awake at night? And he says, what keeps me awake at night is that another Gorbachev may emerge in China.
The Chinese word for perestroika.
So that is one point. And it's very revealing that this should be considered to be the great danger in China. The second point he made, and in fact, the second and third point relate exactly to the armed forces. Second point he made was, why did the party which had ruled, the Soviet Union for so many decades and was such a symbol of great strength and power, how did it suddenly disintegrate? Something must have happened. So he said there were two reasons. One was that both within the party and the armed forces, the ideological commitment to Marxism-Leninism was allowed to diminish and evaporate. So when the crisis happened, the kind of spiritual strength or ideological strength which was required to deal with the crisis was simply not there. And the third element was that the army had been made a professional army. It had lost its party character. Therefore, when a crisis occurred, the armed forces sat on the sidelines.
Correct.
They did not think that it was their duty to actually safeguard the party, because their connection with the party had over the years been broken. So they were just a witness. They did not take any action, and they had very little commitment to actually safeguarding the party. And then he says, this is what we cannot have in China. Yeah. That number one, we must have ideological commitment across the board within the party. So party education becomes very important. And secondly, we must never forget that the armed forces are armed forces of the party. They are a sentinel for the party. They are a guardian of the party. So professionalization of the armed forces does not mean that it loses its character as, in fact, an instrument of the party. So I'm mentioning this because I think this gives you a sense of what is driving some of the things that he is doing.
No, it's very important. I think सरन साहब, आपने अभी जिस प्रकार से ये वर्णन किया है, मैं कहूँगा कि चीन के जो इस वक्त कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी की सेंटिनरी की जो हम बात कर रहे हैं, और जिस दायरे में आपने कई सारे मुद्दों को रेखांकित किया है, खास जहां तक पार्टी और फौज के बीच में जो तालमेल है, मैं आपसे ये रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा कि जितना भी अभी हमने समझने की कोशिश की है शी जिनपिंग साहब के बारे में, उनकी नेतृत्व, उनके क्या क्या उद्देश्य हैं, भारत के लिए इसके क्या असर होगा, खास जब हम ये जो द्विपक्षीय रिश्ता है, अभी हम पोस्ट गलवान की बात करते हैं, काफी तनाव है अभी भी लद्दाख के क्षेत्र में, दोनों जो फौज हैं कहा जाता है कि आईबॉल टू आईबॉल है, तो इस वक्त भारत के लिए व्हाट आर द इम्प्लीकेशंस, अगर आप इसके बारे में कुछ।
No, the implications are very clear. यह है कि अगर हम अगले 10 सालों की बात कर रहे हैं, अगले 20 सालों की बात कर रहे हैं, तो एक तो ये बहुत जाहिर है कि हमारे लिए सबसे बड़ी चुनौती चीन की चुनौती होगी. द चाइना चैलेंज इज गोइंग टू बी योर डिफाइनिंग चैलेंज. और किस तरह हम इससे जूझते हैं, किस तरह हम इस ये चुनौती का सामना करते हैं, टू अ वेरी लार्ज एक्सटेंट विल डिटरमिन what is going to be the place of India both in Asia as well as in the world. तो ये समझना बहुत बहुत आवश्यक है कि सबसे बड़ी चुनौती चीन ही होगी. जो कुछ भी उन्होंने उपलब्धि प्राप्त की है वो तो आपके सामने है, लेकिन ये भी जानना चाहिए कि ये ओनली द फर्स्ट सेंटेनरी है. दूसरी एक सेंटेनरी आने वाली है 2049 में. और टीचिंग पीएम बोल रहे हैं कि अब हमें उस रास्ते पे अग्रसर होना है, उस रास्ते पे चलना है विथ रिन्यूड एम्फेसिस, विथ रिन्यूड एनर्जी, क्योंकि वहां जब हम पहुंचेंगे तो वी विल बी द स्ट्रॉन्गेस्ट पावर परहैप्स इन हिस्ट्री ऑफ द वर्ल्ड इफ द प्रेजेंट ट्रेंड कंटिन्यूज. नाउ there may be people in India and abroad who will say, "Oh, this is a pipe dream," or there are so many challenges that China itself is facing. There is a demographic challenge. It is becoming old before it is becoming rich. It is a very tightly controlled society, so the kind of creativity and innovation which are hallmarks of a liberal democratic society, वो इनके पास नहीं होगी. हो सकता है, मैं ये नहीं कहता हूं कि ये संभावना नहीं है, लेकिन हमें इस बात को मान के चलना है कि हो सकता है कि ये जो 2049 की सेंटेनरी की बात कर रहे हैं, ये मुमकिन है that China will be a stronger power at least than it is today. Even if we don't say it will become the strongest power in the world. तो ये मान के चलना है. अगर वो नहीं होता है तो वो हमारे लिए बोनस है. लेकिन हमें ये मान के चलना है कि हाँ,
ये होगा.
ये संभावना है और उसके लिए हमको क्या करना है. So I have said so many times before that you see the biggest challenge for us is how do we begin to reduce the yawning gap in economic, military, technological capabilities which has come about between our two countries. We have to shrink that. Not that you must do it 100%, but the world must see that you are actually reducing that gap. Because if you start reducing that gap, then your diplomatic options will expand. हाँ, तो और ये मिलिट्री को केवल स्ट्रेंथन करना ये संभव नहीं है जब तक कि आपकी इकोनॉमी स्ट्रेंथन नहीं. और ये भी चाइना का लेसन है. चाइना का लेसन ये भी है कि उन्होंने पहले फोकस किया आर्थिक स्थिति पे, आर्थिक ये प्रगति पे, और उससे रिसोर्सेज जनरेट हुई जिससे कि वो मिलिट्री को और स्ट्रेंथन कर रहे हैं. तो हमारे लिए और कोई चारा है नहीं भारत के लिए. ये बहुत जरूरी है क्योंकि द चाइनीज कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ पावर, लेट अस नॉट फॉरगेट, इज हायरार्किकल. It does not permit a multipolar structure. We should understand that. Absolutely. That there is no place for two suns in the Asian firmament. Okay. So if you want to contest that, you can only contest that by rising up to be the kind of countervailing power that others can look up to. We are unfortunately not in that position today. We have to, if we do not acknowledge our weaknesses, if we do not acknowledge our vulnerabilities, how do we go about addressing them? That is something which is very important.
No, sir, thank you. I think this particular last kind of aspect that you focused on, that what are the lessons that India needs to draw or derive from this particular centenary are very, very clear and stuff. And I think this correlation between the strength of the military and the exchequer is something that is really a foundational kind of tenet.
Yeah.
But on that note, there are so many issues that I would like to take up.
Yeah, I would like to, if you permit me, please. Important element which I think we should look at. One is that, amongst the reforms that Deng Xiaoping introduced was putting the party, not saying that the party's authority should be diminished, but what he did was he put the party in a supervisory position. That is, party's authority is recognized, but the party does not directly interfere, for example, in the state, and does not interfere directly in the armed forces. So professionalization of the armed forces was one of the lessons which was drawn from what you mentioned as the Gulf War. There was another incident which also played a very important role, which was what happened in the Taiwan Strait in 1996.
Correct. Bill Clinton.
Yeah, when he sent the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese said, never again.
Correct.
We have to build up those capabilities to be able to deal with this. And that was also a spur to professionalization of the armed forces, specialization within the armed forces. तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा रिफॉर्म था. Informatized warfare, if you remember 1991 ka lesson, and then building up the naval forces, particularly from the 1996 experience. So there was a trend towards greater specialization, greater technocratic sort of specialization.
Correct.
Also, at the same time, the private sector actually was the engine of growth over the last so many years. The state-owned enterprises were sort of, in a sense, marginalized. A large number of people became unemployed as a result. But the economy started growing very rapidly because of the private sector. Companies like Alibaba, companies like, Baidu, these are the ones who actually provided the engine of growth for the. So it was that, yes, the party must exercise supervisory authority, but the party will not directly interfere in the activities of the state. It will not interfere in the activities of the armed forces and in the activities of the private sector or the corporate sector.
Correct.
One of the things that Xi Jinping has done, and something that we must watch out for going forward, is that these distinctions have been done away with.
Yeah, correct.
So the party is actively involved in the state, actively involved in the armed forces, and as you have seen recently, very actively now involved even in the private or the corporate sector. तो ये जो डिस्टिंक्शन था कि पार्टी की जो रोल है वो सुपरवाइजरी रोल है, वो अब नहीं है. Party active participant hai in all these various instruments. That is one. The second important thing for India to remember is that there is now an accepted strategy of civil military fusion.
Correct.
मतलब कि जो कुछ भी हो रहा है प्राइवेट सेक्टर में, आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस हो, साइबर की कैपेबिलिटीज हो, वो सारी कैपेबिलिटीज are available to the state as well. And the champions of future growth in the high technology sectors will now be the state-owned enterprises, not the private sector. तो इसके economic implications भी हैं, जिसको हमको समझना पड़ेगा. Thank you. I just wanted to make this point because these are trends which might be worthwhile.
No, I think this is a very important point, and I think thank you for sharing this. There's so much, sir, that one would like to talk to you, but it's really, I think, the tyranny of time. But I just want to close on one last point, which is, again, picking up from what you said. This interregnum from 2021 to 2049,
yes,
the next 28 years are going to be, I think, very, very eventful. And I'm limiting my observation to what does this mean for India?
Yeah.
I think one of the strands is a far more astute understanding of strategic geography. Meaning that for India, whether we talk about 1962 or we talk about the post-Galwan phase that we are now experiencing, the understanding of geography and its strategic connotations, particularly when we talk about a territorial consensus, modus vivendi between India and China, whenever it happens. My sense, and I'm just going to leave this as a thought and maybe invite you again to talk about this, is that there is a far greater and a deeper understanding between the party and the PLA about strategic geography, whether it was the former Soviet Union or Southeast Asia or South Asia or as far as Taiwan, etc. are concerned. But this is really, I think, something that we need to ponder over, especially when Arunachal is something that bobs up and down when we talk about the so-called Chinese claim. But I'll leave it at that for now. And thank you, Shyam sir, for sharing your thoughts, I think, on a very important subject. And I do hope that we'll be able to invite you again very soon to continue this discussion.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
On that note, thank you, sir. And thank you for watching Security Analysis. We will be back very soon with another subject next week. Thank you and Jai Hind.